In the small country town, surrounded by green hills and surrounded by the soft sound of the wind passing through the pine trees, there lived Joachim, the local gravedigger. At 58 years old, he had calloused hands, eyes that carried the wisdom of years, and a heart that overflowed with an unusual love for his profession, history, and even beauty. The ancient tombs with their tombstones covered in moss seemed to tell stories that only he understood. Each life that passed through here he left. A little of himself he used to tell the few who asked him about him. It seemed so while he worked. The cemetery was the heart of the small town, a place where generations were gathered in the silence of the earth. Joachim treated each grave with reverence, cleaning the tombstones, planting flowers, and ensuring that the space remained worthy. For those who rested there, he believed that death was not the end, but a point of transition, and he saw himself as a guardian, a caretaker of memories of his dedication. Not everyone understood his love for work. Some residents found him eccentric. Others simply could not understand how someone could face everyday life in the cemetery with such lightness. But Joachim didn't care about other people's opinions. He saw the cemetery as an extension of life, where silence allowed for deep reflections, and nature showed its beauty, with flowers blooming even in the shadows. Denser, he lived alone in a modest house right at the entrance to the cemetery. A dog, with caramel eyes called Morning, was his only constant companion. The animal, as well as the owner, seemed to be in harmony with the environment, walking calmly among the tombs while Joachim worked at night. Sitting on the porch of his house with a tea, Joa looked at the starry sky and felt at peace. Joachim had a secret that he kept deep in his soul, something that none of the residents of that peaceful town would ever suspect. He deeply loved a woman called Clara. Clara was the owner of a soft beauty with brown hair that shone in the sun and a smile that made Joachim forget for a moment the tombstones that populated his routine. However, she was married to Osvaldo, a man known for his explosive temper and unhealthy jealousy. Joachim, those moments were like breathing after a lifetime in a closed room. Clara also loved him, but the fear of Osvaldo prevented her from even thinking about abandoning her husband one afternoon while they were together in the cabin, laughing and planning an impossible future. Destiny L played a trick. Cruel Joachim was distracted, holding Clara's hands when the door was broken down with a bang. It was Osvaldo. His eyes shone with a fury that seemed to set the room on fire without thinking twice. Joachim reacted to the instinct of survival. He ran through the side window, disappearing into the dense forest. Osvaldo was unable to identify him, but Clara, who remained behind, was not so lucky. What happened next was the beginning of the greatest torment of Joachim's life. With a knife in his hands, Osvaldo, blind with hatred, dealt fatal blows to Clara, taking her life in a fit of brutality. She, who moments before was full of laughter and love, was silenced forever. Her body was found in the cabin days later, and her husband, although suspicious, claimed that he had acted in self-defense when caught with a stranger. No one questioned Osvaldo's version that he was influential and feared in the city. What Joachim never imagined, however, was that Clara would be buried in the same cemetery where he dedicated his days. The most beautiful flowers on the tombstone, and he took care of the tomb as if it were the greatest treasure of his life. The cemetery, that used to be a place of peace and reflection for him, became a space full of painful memories. Every time he passed by Clara's grave, he felt a tightness in his heart, a weight that made him question whether he could continue living. But at the same time, he found solace in taking care of her last resting place, ensuring that even in death, Clara would continue to receive his love. The wind that passed through the cemetery seemed to whisper her name. Her and Joachim, in his heart, promised that he would never let Clara's memory fade. The gravedigger, who used to love his work because of its connection with the story of each life, now worked with the sole purpose of keeping alive the story of love that he carried in his chest. He never left the tomb, Without fresh flowers, even in the harshest winter, Elisa had been the great love of his life, a passion that never had the chance to come true on a full moon night. The clock was showing midnight. When Jose decided to make his last ronda, the fog was so dense that his flashlight only illuminated a few meters ahead. He walked through the tombs with slow steps, listening only to the sound of his own heart and the rustling of the wind it was. Then that he heard first a low moan, then light steps as if someone was sliding across the stone floor. He stopped, feeling the air freeze around him. His flashlight wavered, and it was at that moment that he saw a translucent figure, a woman with long white hair floating between the tombs. Her eyes were empty, but they seemed to penetrate straight into Jose's soul. He let out a muffled scream and put his hand to his chest. A sharp pain cut through his heart, and before he could understand what was happening, he fell on the cold ground of the cemetery. His last thought was Elisa's face as he remembered her in life. The next morning, Joachim woke up with his frozen body lying on the cold ground of the cemetery when he opened his eyes. It took a few seconds to understanding where it was. The sky was beginning to lighten as the sun rose, and the low mist hung between the tombs, giving the place an ethereal atmosphere. He felt the weight of the damp earth on his clothes and realized that he was lying next to Elisa's grave. For a moment, he remained motionless, trying to remember how he had ended up there. The last thing he remembered was being in his small house, getting ready to sleep after another day of work. But how he had gotten out, and worse, because he was in the cemetery specifically next to that grave, was a mystery. Joachim sat down, slowly rubbing his face with his hands, as if trying to drive away a dream confused or an insistent nightmare, but his mind was blank. Looking around, everything seemed as always. The tombs lined up the flowers he had placed the day before, still fresh on Elisa's tomb. Nothing out of the ordinary except himself sitting there with no memory of how or why. With a deep sigh, he got up. He wiped the dirt off his pants and began to straighten the space around the tomb. As he did every day, he felt a slight discomfort in his chest, but decided for him to take care of that place. It was a relief and a routine that filled the void left. By Elisa, without any further questions or explanations, Joachim returned to work as if nothing had happened, but a strange sensation accompanied him. It was as if something that night had tried to communicate with him, but the words had escaped his memory. Wake him around Elisa's grave, but something inside him seemed different. Time passed, the hours dragged by, and he did not feel the slightest sign of tiredness. His hands, usually sore after a whole day of work, did not hurt. His breathing was calm, and the cold of the morning seemed unable to penetrate his skin. Even more intriguing, the hunger that used to bother him. After 2 hours was completely absent, he cleaned the marble of the tomb, arranged the flowers, and removed the fallen leaves, moving with an almost automatic determination. But no matter how much he completed his tasks, he felt a strange need to remain there. Every time he thought about moving away, an invisible weight seemed to hold him back. It was as if something was calling him to stay, a gentle but irresistible force that held his attention. At the tomb, Joachim began to question what was happening. He had never felt anything like it. He tried to convince himself that it was just a passing impression resulting from a bad night's sleep or the intense cold of that morning. However, as the hours went on, the strangeness of the situation became impossible to ignore. He looked at the sky. The sun was already high, but the glow seemed pale in the distance, as if there was a veil between him and the world around him. He tried to remember some detail from the previous night, but his mind was a blur. The only clear thought was that of Elisa, her face smiling and serene as he remembered her in life. A disturbing idea began to appear in his mind, but he quickly pushed it away, as if he were afraid to face her. Suddenly, he felt a shiver run down his spine. It was not fear, but a strange feeling as if he was being watched. He looked around, but there was no one, just the silence of the cemetery and the distant sound of leaves in the wind. Yet the feeling of presence was unmistakable almost. Tangible even. So Joachim remained there, unable to move away from whatever was happening. He knew he was deeply connected to that tomb, and although a part of him wanted to understand another part, he felt that perhaps it was better not to know Joachim. Only realized that night had arrived when the last rays of the sun disappeared over the horizon, and the few people who visited the cemetery began to leave. He saw an elderly lady leave flowers on a distant tomb, and a young man lighting candles. Next to an old tombstone, he watched those offer away with growing uneasiness. He felt that something was wrong, but he still didn't know exactly what it was. When he tried to follow the small group leaving through the cemetery gates, he realized that he couldn't move his feet towards them. It was as if an invisible force was holding him to the ground, forcing him to remain there. He had tried again with more force, but his steps were not taking him any further. He felt his heart speed up, a mixture of fear and disbelief growing inside him. He called out to one of the people passing by, but his voice was weak, almost like a whisper that the wind gone. No one heard him. Joachim. He shook his head, rubbing his eyes as if trying to wake up from a strange dream. But that wasn't a dream. He was there, completely conscious, trapped between the tombs that he cared so much about as night fell. The cemetery was taken by an absolute silence. The only light came from the full moon that cast long, distorted shadows over the place. Joachim tried to calm down, but fear consumed him. He began to walk around the tombs as if he looked for an answer, but something inside him compelled him to always return to the same place. Elisa's grave. He sat next to the tombstone, his eyes fixed on the name engraved in the marble. The feeling of prison was suffocating. It wasn't just physical. It was as if something was holding his soul there, making it impossible for him to leave. He muttered to himself, his voice trembling, "What's happening? Why can't I get out of here?" The answer didn't come. Just the wind blew cold and carried a heavy silence. He stood there, scared and helpless among the tombs that used to bring him peace. But that now seemed more strange and intimidating than ever. The night was long, and Joachim knew that something deep and inexplicable was waiting for him. In the heart of that cemetery, the night passed, and Joachim remained there motionless. In what now seemed to be his new world, dawn slowly arrived, bringing with it the first rays of the sun that broke through the thick fog of the cemetery. While he looked around, lost in thought, and without understanding what was happening, he saw a woman walking among the tombs. Joachim didn't know her, but something in her presence intrigued him. "Girl," called him with a tone that mixed despair and hope. Woman stopped and looked in his direction. Surprised by the call, she approached slowly, her gaze full of curiosity. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Joachim, confused and feeling the weight of his situation, he answered with sincerity, "I'm trapped here. I can't leave this place. I need your help." "Please." The woman looked at him for a moment, as if trying to understand. "Elkia says." Then he shook his head with regret. "Unfortunately, I can't help you, but I can say a prayer for you." He laughed, but it was a nervous, almost desperate laugh. "A prayer that won't do any good," he said, frustrated. "I need something concrete, no words in the wind." Anyway, the woman ignored his disbelief and began to pray. She joined her hands and with a firm voice began to murmur words that seemed to echo through the silence of the cemetery. "My God, help this lost soul to find rest, no matter what he did in life, nor to the reasons that keep him here. He needs to leave this world and follow his destiny." As she spoke, Joachim, he began to feel something different. A strange and disturbing feeling took over him, as if those words were stirring something deep inside his essence. Scared, he interrupted the woman. "Why are you praying like that? What do you know about me?" he asked with wide eyes and a trembling voice. The woman opened her eyes, and her gaze met Joachim's with a mixture of compassion and certainty. "Because I know you, Joachim. You didn't notice, but you are no longer part of this world. I see dead people. I have this gift, but other normal people can't see you. The morning after your last night, the residents of the village found your absence strange. You didn't show up to buy bread as you did every day, worried. They came here. Joachim felt the ground seem to crumble beneath his feet. As the woman continued, they found him lying next to Elisa's tomb, with his face serene and his hands resting on his chest. You were so at peace that he seemed to have simply fallen asleep. They buried him next to her in the place you always cared for with so much love. He shook his head, refusing to believe. No, that couldn't be true. But deep down, the woman's words made sense. The pieces began to fall into place. The absence of hunger, the feeling of being trapped in the cemetery. He looked around, and the world seemed more distant, as if it no longer belonged to you. The love you feel for her transcends time. Joachim, but now it's time to rest. Don't be afraid, you will meet again in a better place. Joachim was stunned by the woman's words. He tried to speak, but his voice came out shaky, a reflection of the confusion and fear that now took over his mind. What do you mean? He asked, his voice full of disbelief. Are you really saying that I was the woman? Looked at him with a mixture of pity and understanding. Yes, it is, but not in the way you believe. You are trapped between this world and the next because something still holds you here, Joachim, and from what I see, it is her words hit him like a thunder. He looked at Elisa's tomb, the name engraved on the tombstone seeming to shine under the light of dawn. The woman pointed to a tomb where her name was written and containing a photo of her, Joachim. She is gone. There is only her remains, and you also don't need to stay here. Her body is buried there, but her soul can go to meet her if it's over. But that doesn't mean that the love you feel for her will be forgotten. True love is never lost. Now you need to find peace. She began to pray again, her voice filling the space, the emptiness of the cemetery with words full of intention and power. Joachim felt something inside him begin to change. It was as if a soft light was being born in his chest, pushing him away from that place. As the woman continued, Joa felt her form begin to fade away. It wasn't painful, on the contrary. It was as if he was finally letting go of a burden he had been carrying for years. He looked one last time at Elisa's grave, and for the first time in a long time, he felt peace. The woman stopped praying and opened her eyes. Jotha's cemetery and the soft rustling of the wind remained. She smiled lightly, made the sign of the cross, and left, leaving behind that place where an eternal love had finally found rest, when everything returned to calm. She sighed, clasped her hands in prayer for a brief moment, and then turned around, walking with firm steps towards the gate. Without looking back, the woman passed through the cemetery entrance and followed her path along the path that led back to the village, disappearing in the morning mist. Only the sound of her footsteps moving away remained as a reminder of his brief but meaningful visit, and the cemetery, now more peaceful than ever, became the testimony of a soul that had finally found its rest. Share this story with someone who also likes scary mysteries. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next video if you're still here.